Hello and welcome to Under the Microscope. I'm here today with Patrick Stover, the winner of the 2023 W.O. Atwater Memorial Lectureship. Dr. Stover delivered an excellent lecture this year in association with his award, and I'm going to talk to him a little about that today in more detail. Before I do, I'd like to give a brief introduction. Dr. Stover is the director of the Institute for Advancing Health Through Agriculture at Texas A&M University. As an international leader in biochemistry, agriculture, and nutrition, Dr. Stover's research focuses on the biochemical, genetic, and epigenetic mechanisms that underlie the relationships between nutrition, food fortification, and human pathologies. He's won a number of awards and was an elected member of the National Academy of Sciences, as well as a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Earlier in his career, he received the Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers from President Clinton, which is the highest honor bestowed by the U.S. government on outstanding scientists and engineers beginning their careers. We're very honored to have you with us today, Dr. Stover.
Thank you very much, Catherine. It's a real pleasure to be here with you.
Well, without further ado, I'd love to jump in and just chat a little about some of what you shared with us. So you gave a talk entitled Enhancing the Purpose of Food, which focused on a paradigm shift in the way we look at agriculture and its goals compared to the past. So what is the core shift that you're talking about, and why has it occurred?
Certainly. Well, the shift that we're seeing is really related again to the purpose of the food supply. And the shift is moving exclusively from a focus on hunger, whether that be caloric deficit or hidden hunger, lack of micronutrients, to the end point of both hunger and health. That is, how do we design a food system that makes people healthy, not merely prevents hunger? And this really originated, the food system we have today, out of the World War II era, both the Great Depression and the World War II era, where hunger was the focus, eliminating hunger through agriculture. Now we have a different problem. Hunger still exists today in the United States, but it exists not because we don't produce enough food, but other issues of access and so forth and so on. So the question is, how do we tweak the architecture of the food system to expand that goal to include both hunger and health, and deal with the skyrocketing healthcare costs that we have related to diet-induced chronic diseases like diabetes, like heart disease, like certain cancers. And that is the biggest challenge, I think, of this coming century.
Well, how did you become interested in this change from hunger to health, and how did that sort of influence the relationships that you've explored in your own research between diet and health?
No, that's a great question. Like everything else, it was a bit of an accident. Most of my research is very fundamental research related to how nutrition and metabolism intersect, and really asking those questions within metabolic networks. How do cells decide at all sorts of junction points how to mediate flux through pathways just to maintain homeostasis? So my personal research is very fundamental in that way, trying to understand metabolism, metabolic networks, and then their connection to disease endpoints like cancer, like neuropathies, like birth defects. So we work in my laboratory understanding metabolism and then look at mice and try to translate some of that very basic network information to mouse models to look at diseases. And a lot of the focus on my work has been on that connection between folic acid and prevention of birth defects. And we know this works from clinical trials, yet we still don't know how it works. And that's what my laboratory tries to understand, is how folic acid prevents birth defects. Because of that fundamental research, I then was asked to be on a number of expert panels for the FDA, for the Center of Disease Control, for the World Health Organization, etc., really using my expertise in fundamental science to help guide certain policies around fortification, and as well as implementation of fortification initiatives. And so it's just a natural sort of progression, which we see for a lot of nutrition scientists, where once you're recognized as an expert in one domain, then you're going to be called upon by decision-making bodies to help advise them on what the best policies are. And that's how I wandered into this space.
And it is a big space. I'd love to explore a little more broadly the question of some of these diseases that you mentioned. So we talk about the role of diet in chronic disease. You mentioned diabetes, you mentioned heart disease. Are those the main diseases of concern? Are there others? How widespread are they, and how exactly is their prevalence related to our food system?
I mean, so it comes as no surprise to anyone that we have an epidemic right now of overweight, of obesity, leading to secondary comorbidities such as neuropathies, such as diabetes, etc. So that is obviously a major concern in this country. I think everyone is familiar with the density maps that the CDC puts out. So it's a major public health concern. However, we have to understand that the diet-disease connection goes well beyond obesity. There is now an understanding that when we switch from hunger to health, for hunger, people respond similarly across virtually all demographics other than age, in some case sex, but with a minimum number of subgroups, people respond the same in terms of the food and nutrients they consume, and then their risk of hunger or hidden hunger, nutrient deficiencies. When we use the health outcome, we know there's a tremendous amount of heterogeneity in the population. And we know that there are certain women who need more folic acid than others to mitigate their risk of having a child with spina bifida, a neural tube closure defect in the offspring. So we know that people differ in terms of how they react to food and how they react differently in a dose-response relationship to health outcomes. And that's what's really brought on the whole initiative around precision nutrition, moving from hunger to health. Where in hunger, within a population, most people respond the same. When you use the health outcome, you get great heterogeneity. And it raises two questions. How do we begin to identify, both in terms of individuals and subgroups, what foods are best for any one person to maintain their health throughout the lifespan? That's one question. How do we classify them? And then what are the foods and the dietary patterns that are going to promote lifelong health for them?
Great. So you mentioned this concept of precision agriculture, which is a somewhat new concept. And emerging from that, you've also talked about something called responsive agriculture. Can you elaborate a bit on these ideas and tell us about why they've moved front and center in the research on how we farm?
Sure. And again, this really relates to the expectations we have on the food system and agriculture. Again, in the past, really the focus of agriculture related to food was to prevent deficiencies, hunger, and hidden hunger. Now we're seeing other expectations. We're seeing expectations around health, human health. But we're also seeing expectations around environmental health. That is, agriculture does have an environmental footprint. So how do we lower the environmental footprint of agriculture? We also see that there are economic concerns around agriculture. We need an agriculture system that's going to be economically sustainable in the future because we're losing a lot of our precious farmlands to more profitable purposes like urban development, like solar panels, etc. And so we also have to make sure that we have an agriculture and food system that is economically viable looking to the future. So we're talking about human health, we're talking about environmental health, we're talking about economic health. And so we have to grapple with this, and we have to set priorities to achieve these goals, understanding there could be trade-offs between human health outcomes, economic outcomes, environmental outcomes. Precision agriculture is a variety of strategies to be more precise about how we use inputs, how we use water, how we use fertilizer. Can we target it directly on the plant, only give water to the plants that need it, only give pesticides to the plant that need it, etc. A lot of precision agriculture is focused on lowering that environmental footprint. Responsive agriculture is a term that we developed here at Texas A&M at the Institute for Advancing Health Through Agriculture, and that is understanding that agriculture has always been responsive to whatever expectations have been placed on it. When the expectation was to make hunger as least prevalent as possible, agriculture responded and scaled up and brought technologies to bear to create an abundant food system. Now, how can agriculture respond in a way that addresses all the expectations around human health, environmental health, and economic health?
It sounds like there are multiple issues being addressed within the concept of responsive agriculture. So you mentioned people, food, economics, and the environment. Are those areas ever in conflict, or would similar practices support all four simultaneously?
Certainly. Great question, and I will just respond to that question first about sharing an initiative with you, which I talked about in my lecture. But we are currently working in a partnership with USDA-ARS and the Chicago Council to convene experts all across the ag value chain to ask the question, how can we realize responsive agriculture? What are the changes we need to make agriculture responsive to human health, environmental health, and economic health? Now, again, we understand there's going to be trade-offs across those three domains, but for our initiative, we're setting priorities. We believe that the purpose of the food supply is to promote human health. That is the primary purpose. Certainly, agriculture has an environmental footprint. Certainly, there are economic concerns. And all have to be addressed. But first, we have to understand what is the food system we need to create a healthy population. And then that cascades down to other committees saying, okay, well, if that's the ideal food system for the population, what are the strategies we need to make it economically viable, to make it environmentally sustainable, and to do it in a way such that there is equity, that all people have access to the food system that is going to promote their health. So that's the initiative that we have, and to be very clear, we have set priorities. Environment is important, economics is important, but paramount is that human health outcome is the highest priority.
Your work on responsive agriculture divides it into three domains. I'd like to delve a little bit into each one in a little more detail. Can you tell us about what sorts of questions you're investigating and what trends you see in the three domains, starting with reducing diet-related chronic disease?
So we are assembling a committee of experts in that connection between food and chronic disease and all of the various aspects of that to really investigate what are the opportunities we have to make the food environment that people experience every day more health promoting. So we have experts on dietary patterns, we have experts on food labeling, et cetera, et cetera. We're asking the question, where are the opportunities to create a more healthful food system? And what are the interventions that are needed? Are they policy? Are they education? Et cetera, et cetera. So that's the question we're asking with that committee is, what food system do we need? What food environment do we need so that all people have access to a food system that's going to promote their lifelong health?
Now, a second domain that you've identified within responsive agriculture is transforming agricultural ecosystems and the agriculture food value chain. Can you tell us a little bit more about the questions you're investigating there and what you see happening in that area?
Certainly. So as we, over time make progress in understanding what the optimal food system is that addresses the health needs of everyone, then the question is, how do we produce that food? How do we produce it in a way that it's accessible, that it's affordable, that has the smallest environmental impact, and that's economically sustainable? So that's what our second committee is going to be looking at. And certainly we learned a lot from the pandemic. In the pandemic, we learned that we have a really robust food system. And although there were glitches early on, the food system performed very, very well during the pandemic. But what we also realized that it's highly vertically integrated and is not as resilient as we hoped it would be. So we have to look at resiliency within the food system, and how do we create that food that promotes health to make sure that that food is going to be accessible to all people. So we have to look at innovations. You're seeing so many innovations in controlled environmental agriculture. You're seeing innovations in row crop agriculture. You're seeing innovations in technologies like CRISPR that can be used to improve the quality of food, not only improve yields, but improve that quality of food, increase the micronutrient content, try to lower the caloric density in some cases. So we have so many tools and technologies that we can bring to bear to create the food that we need, and realizing that one size doesn't fit all. We need all types of agriculture, and we need to configure it in a way that's going to realize that chronic disease reduction and allow responsive agriculture to flourish.
Great. Now, you've also identified a third domain within responsive agriculture that is characterized as securing nutrition equity across the food environment. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that involves and what kind of research questions you're investigating in it?
Certainly, and that's absolutely critical, because if you want to use food in agriculture to lower rates of chronic disease, if you want to use agriculture and food as the solution to skyrocketing healthcare costs, it's absolutely critical that we address the needs of the underserved communities, because we know that they bear the greatest prevalence of food-related, diet-related chronic disease. And that's where and if we want to use agriculture to lower healthcare costs, and healthcare costs are shared by all of us, we really have to ensure that we address the needs of the underserved to make sure that the food that's going to promote health is equally accessible to all people. Otherwise, agriculture and food will never be the solution to the healthcare crisis that we have, because that's where we have the greatest burden.
I'd love to dig into how these things might look in practice. Can you tell us a little bit about what it might mean for an individual farmer to practice responsive agriculture?
Certainly. Well, again, I gave you the one example in Louisiana of parish rice, where you have a very innovative farmer who is planting a particular variety where he suffers on yield, yet there's evidence that this rice is more health promoting than other varieties of rice, and has created a niche market for that. And in fact, I believe that he has higher margins on that variety than he does on the other rice that he grows. So that's one example. You're seeing examples in vertical agriculture where people are able to change and manipulate the micronutrient content of food that is grown in a controlled environmental setting through hydroponics and other types of technologies, and to improve the micronutrient profile and the health promoting properties of those foods. You're seeing people looking at CRISPR to try to increase micronutrient concentration in food. So you're seeing all sorts of opportunities, and what's important is that we accelerate those tools and technologies, and that we bring the farmers along to show, in fact, that it's in their best interest to try to adopt practices that improve not only the quantity of food that they grow, but the quality of that food in terms of its health-promoting properties. Farmers and ranchers want to be part of the solution of healthcare cost of diet-related chronic disease. Farmers and ranchers are invested in their property. They are very committed to environmental stewardship, because that's where a lot of their investments are, in their land and preserving their land and being able to pass it down from generation to generation. So farmers want to be part of the solution, but it has to work in terms of the economics for them, and they need access to the tools and technologies that are going to enable them to be part of the solution.
What would responsive agriculture look like in practice for the food system as a whole?
And of course, that's the million-dollar question. And what it really relates to, again, responsive agriculture is a response to moving from hunger to health. Because when you move from hunger to health, you need more precision in terms of how we make recommendations around what to eat to promote your health. And as Francis Collins said when he launched the NIH Precision Nutrition Initiative, one size does not fit all in the diet-disease connection. Now, what is the state of precision nutrition? Well, we know when we use that health outcome, one size doesn't fit all. We know that people respond differently to food. So what does that mean for the food environment, for responsive agriculture? It means right now that we need a highly diversified food system to make sure that all individuals have access to the types of food and the quantities of food that they need to promote their health. So as we advance precision nutrition, we have to make sure that individuals or subgroups of individuals, as we identify what foods are best for them to maintain their health, are going to be accessible and available to them in the food environment.
Great. Now, you also spoke in your talk about the transformative role of technology in engineering our agricultural systems, essentially saying we can create a system to target whatever outcome we want. So with that in mind, are there particular technologies that you think have already had that kind of dramatic impact in the past?
Well, again, the most dramatic example, and it's a very simple technology, is fortification of the food supply with folic acid. In 1990s, you used to see, and before that, you used to see an awful lot of little kids in wheelchairs, and they'll be in those wheelchairs for the rest of their life because they were born with a very debilitating neural tube closure defect. When we fortified the food supply, after we had the scientific evidence from clinical trials that it would work, we fortified the food supply with folic acid, we've seen dramatic reductions in the prevalence of neural tube defects. Simple technology, we made the food system what we wanted towards that health outcome, and it worked. We have many other technologies like we've spoken to with CRISPR, with hydroponics, with all sorts of opportunities to make the food supply whatever we want it to be. The question is, what do we want it to be? What does it need to be to achieve that health outcome?
So it sounds like a very optimistic vision of what we're able to do and our capabilities. When you think about that in the future, are there any technologies that you see emerging that you think will dramatically transform farming going forward?
Well, again, then this is a personal point of view. I think we have to make sure that we unleash the power of technologies, and especially CRISPR. Using CRISPR, using related genetic technologies, we can accelerate the progress we're having, both in terms of improving human health outcomes, environmental outcomes, and economic outcomes. And we really have to address some of the resistance that's out there relative to the use of technology and what it can do to improve our food system.
And are there any other technologies that you see on the horizon that you think might dramatically change how agriculture is practiced in this country or in general?
There's so many to choose from. I'm always impressed with the advances that are being made in hydroponics, that is growing food in mass production in controlled greenhouse settings, and where you grow them essentially in a liquid bath. And there's evidence now that you can change the composition of that bath by adding certain nutrients, adding other types of natural compounds that change the composition of that plant. The plant is able to take up these nutrients, and then now you have potentially a plant that is more healthful. So there was work done a couple of years ago by an ARS scientist in California, in Albany, California, where they added vitamin B12 to a hydroponic cocktail. Now, vitamin B12 is an essential nutrient. You need it. If you don't have it, you're going to get anemia, you're going to get neurodegeneration, and it's only present in animal products. Where they were able to place vitamin B12 in a hydroponic bath, and in fact, the plants took it up. And so that's just an amazing example of how we can use a relatively simple technology, if you will, of just adding a nutrient that normally isn't a plant into the hydroponic liquid And now you have a plant that you can grow in mass in a greenhouse that potentially could meet the vitamin B12 needs of individuals.
So this all sounds wonderful, but all changes also require overcoming challenges. Are there any challenges that you foresee in making the transition to a responsive agricultural system? And what do you think about how we might address those challenges?
Well, there's always going to be challenges, right? Change is always difficult. What is critical, in my view, and this is the approach that we are taking with our Responsive Agriculture Initiative, that's a partnership again with USDA-ARS and the Chicago Council. It's imperative that all voices are heard and everyone has a seat at the table, because we have so many opportunities, again, to improve the health profile of the food environment. I think everybody agrees that this is a necessary goal. We know there are barriers to achieving that. Some of it is research and knowledge. Other issues in terms of implementing different changes that we believe will make a more healthful food supply. But what's critical is trust, and that everyone has a seat at the table. Everyone from farmers and ranchers to food manufacturers, et cetera, all across the entire ag value chain. If we bring everybody together towards a common goal, I think anything is possible.
So are there things that people who are watching today can and maybe should do, either to help realize this broader idea of responsive agriculture or to improve diet and health in their own lives based on what you've shared?
Certainly. And again, the consumer is absolutely critical in all of this. Our Responsive Ag Initiative goes from farm inputs to that food environment that people live and experience every day, but yet it's the consumer who's going to make the decisions. And what we know right now is that a lot of consumer behavior is driven by preferences, values, beliefs, and not necessarily by the science and the science of health, right? And of course, food is very complex, right? There's a cultural component to it. There's an enjoyment component to it. There's also a health component. And I think what's critical, and it's really a challenge for all of us in agriculture and in science, is to really continue to beat the drum around what is science, what the science says about that connection between food and health. Realizing that preferences are important, values are important, beliefs are important, but they're not science. And if we're going to achieve the food system that lowers healthcare costs, that realizes responsive agriculture, we're going to have to make science the priority, and we have to bring the consumer along. It'll be a challenge, but that's the challenge we have.
Well, that's exciting. It sounds like a significant change, but one that could really yield tremendous benefits for individuals and society. So, Dr. Stover, we really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us today and to share your wealth of knowledge. So, thank you so much, and congratulations again on being the Memorial Lecturer.
Thank you, Catherine. It was a pleasure to be with you today.